Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome. My name is Lisa Gear. I'm the Dean of Admissions at Southwestern. I see a couple familiar faces and names, so thanks for joining us again for one of our Southwestern Spotlight speaker series. Tonight we are featuring Kate Lawrence. She's an alum from Southwestern who's going to spend a little bit of time with us tonight talking about her career, her work in family law in Canada, all sorts of different things. So without much ado, we're going to turn it over to Kate. I will ask that everyone stay on mute. You can raise your physical hand for questions, or you can use the raise hand feature within Zoom and we'll call on you. If you have some questions here and there, you can also enter them into the chat and we'll try to get to those as soon as we can. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kate.
Hello, everybody. So good to see everybody. Hope all is well in Southern California. We have an unusually sunny day here in North Vancouver, BC. It's usually pouring by this time of year, but we're getting a lovely, lovely day. So as Lisa said, my name is Kate Lawrence. I graduated from Southwestern in 2012. Lisa asked me to talk about the pathway to law school. I actually went to law school thinking I would do estates and administration. And the reason why I thought that is because I was a professional fundraiser prior to going to law school. So those annoying people who call you up from your alma maters asking you for money, I was the one who did that. And I'll talk about why that ended up actually being quite helpful during my current career. But in any event, I had a mentor who was a lawyer, and she left practice and was doing estates and other types of gifts when it came to the nonprofit world. So leaving a charitable gift in a will, for example, and she would speak to alums. And I thought that was really interesting. It was a very academic way of looking at fundraising. And so I was pretty keen to do that. So I ended up working full time during the day and then going to night school as part of the night program. And that was a lot of work, but it was really rewarding at the end because the amount of hours I had to put in working for full time and then going to school at night actually served me well when it came to working in actual practice. In any event, I started taking classes, and the first time I could take an elective course, I signed up for Professors Juhas and Gordon's, who was then Commissioner Gordon, but is now Judge Gordon, class at Southwestern for family law. And it was awesome. First of all, those two professors are amazing. If you haven't taken their class, I hope they still offer it. They're very amusing. But it was also just the first time I could see how law really impacted people's lives every day. Also, the stories were great. It was, the case law was very similar to reading a tabloid newspaper, but it was just so much more interesting because it, applied the rule of law. So I really enjoyed that class. And after I took that class, I was sold. I had decided, you know what, this is so interesting. I have to do this. So I ended up shortly after that leaving the fundraising world and started to really work towards doing family law stuff. So I ended up interning at the Harriet Buhai Center for Family Law, which I hope they're still there and still doing good works. And I ended up doing an externship with Prototypes, which also was really interesting. And in both those places, I was dealing and working with people who were survivors of domestic violence. They were dealing with custody cases. And, I was working with a lot of indigent and low-income people and dealing with their family law issues. And what I learned about family law is that because it's about your life, it touches every aspect of your life. So for example, we were dealing with Hague applications because many of the people I was working with, their ex-spouse was in Mexico and we had to get them served, or they had a house and they had to sell their house and there was property issues, or tax issues, or whatever those issues are. But it was so much more than just divorce and just custody and parenting. It was everything that touched that person's life. So then after that, I wanted to see how domestic violence was dealt with from a criminal perspective. So I ended up joining the Los Angeles Attorney's Office, City Attorney's Office, sorry. And so I dealt with and clerked there, and that was really interesting, dealing with some that was crazy. That was, I was doing that right during the time of Occupy LA. Also the Michael Jackson trial was happening then. It was very wild. And trying to get into the courthouse and dealing with all that was just insane. But in any event, that gave me a different perspective of domestic violence, which was typically we were dealing with victims who had made allegations about domestic violence, but then recanted them. And if you have worked with victims or survivors, depending on your perspective of domestic violence, they do tend to make those allegations and then recant them, not because they're not true, but because they're afraid of losing their family or their source of income or their housing or their livelihoods or their reputation or so many other reasons. And so that was different, because before I was working with women and some men who were ready to leave the relationship and take the necessary steps to move forward and to leave the relationship. But from the criminal perspective, I was working with individuals who were not ready to do that. And so we were dealing with, and I forget the case law now because this was quite some time ago, but it was specifically how do you make submissions to court when you have to tell the court essentially, don't trust her new evidence, which is that she's recanting her prior sworn testimony. So that was very interesting. There's a lot of other stuff that I did that was because I was working with a lot of sexual violence, and it was quite gross in my opinion. So I decided that criminal law was not for me. And so shortly thereafter, I took the California bar, but I knew at that time that I was planning to go back home. I'm originally from North Vancouver, BC. My parents are American, so I was able to go to the States and go to school in Southern California, both for my undergrad and then for law school, and work there. But at the time I entered law school was just after, it was August of 2008. And as you know, the world drastically changed after October of 2008. So by the time I graduated, there were no jobs in California. We were still in full recession. The jobs that even my classmates who had parents in law firms, they were even struggling to get jobs. So I decided to go back north and go back home because there was more opportunities in Canada for me at the time. So then I did the process of having my law degree from the States transfer to Canada. That's called the National Committee on Accreditation. If you're interested, if you are Canadian, or you're looking to, go abroad and work in law, it's not impossible to make that transition. The skills that you learn in law school, no matter where you are, yes, in Southwestern is a California law school, you tend to look at California law. But the reality is that it's the skills that you learn in law school, such as legal research, how to interpret the law, looking at case law, finding the cases that apply, and then applying those cases to your current case. And your current case is going to be wherever you are. Those skills are still relevant no matter where you practice. Even if you decide to go to California, go to another state or another country for that matter, that so long as it's common law. Canada is common law, so that's why the transition was not very difficult. In any event, I was still set on doing family law. I took some time off because for those of you who are either studying for the California bar or looking at it, or I was quite traumatized by the California bar. It was very difficult for me. Best of luck to all of you. You're all going to do really well. But in any event, I decided to take some time off. And during that time, I went back to fundraising. So having a previous career or another career was really helpful for me to get me through that period where I needed to study to pass exams to be able to practice in Canada. So then after that, I had to do an articling period once I passed my exams. And articling in Canada and many other Commonwealth countries is very similar to a residency. You're paid for it, but they're paying for you to learn how to practice law. And so I was able to find that with a boutique family law firm, and I worked real hard. Articles were not easy. I was typically working from 8 a.m. in the morning until 10 p.m. or sometimes 4 a.m. in the morning. But law is a practice, and it's called a practice for a reason. You have to put in the hours and you have to practice in order to get better. So after my year of articling and passing the bar here in Canada, which was a very different experience than it was in California, I've been practicing family law ever since. So family law is more than just dealing with two people who are bickering. The type of family law that I deal with is I'm dividing companies, so it's the opposite of mergers and acquisitions. And we're looking at the value of properties. Typically, we're looking at property, both real estate here, maybe company or commercial real estate. And oftentimes, because Vancouver is a very international city, we have a large population of, we have a large Asian population here. We're looking at property located in other countries. Oftentimes, and particularly, we're looking at business assets and property located in the United States. And so having that American background, I was able to translate some of those issues, understanding, for example, that if someone has a company registered in the United States, it's either going to be registered in Delaware or Nevada. Most of my compatriots here didn't know that, but because I had been had gone to an American law school, I had that information. So it was, I could direct my, my assistant to do a business search in those two states before we went anywhere else. There's tax issues. Tax issues are a huge part of law, no matter what you do, but particularly family law. I would say if you have the opportunity to take a tax course, as boring as it will be, I definitely recommend that you do it, because I have to say some of the stuff that I deal with almost every day is tax. I'm looking at income. So if someone is, for example, working under the table, we have to gross their income up for tax. So to properly calculate their child support and spousal support needs. Tax issues rise all the time when we're doing cohabitation agreements. The biggest one I deal with that's cross-border is the issue of capital gains, especially on the sale of a primary residence. In Canada, you don't pay tax or capital gains on a primary residence. You do in the States, but as a joint citizen, you're going to have to pay capital gains on your primary residence in Canada. So how does that impact an agreement? Well, if your home, which many homes in Vancouver are over $1 million, you're looking at a $200,000 tax bill. If you don't know that, those are the types of issues that will really impact your practice and will give you an edge over, another lawyer who may have no idea that you're going to have to pay capital gains as an American. And so I've had to write those sort of clauses into agreements to make sure that those types of issues are taken into account, because that is a huge, that's negligence. If you're not saving your client $200,000, well, that's a court case. That's worth it to go and litigate over. So you're not doing your client any favors if they're having to deal with this tax issue down the way. So those are the big issues that I deal with almost all the time. So yeah, if anyone has any questions about any of that, I do want to do a quick plug for articling students. So I mentioned that as part of the process here, we need to do articling, which is, like I said, a residency. If any of you are Canadian or are thinking of moving to Canada, which I know since 2016, that has been foremost on a lot of Americans' mind, is that's it, we're moving to Canada. But if you have actually decided to take that plunge, and you may be more keen to do that if the election, or depending on the outcome of the election. But in any event, we do have articling positions here. You're more than welcome to contact me. We're always looking for students. We have a lot of work here. And you would get a really robust experience working with me and my firm. So that's my 2 cents and my plug. So subject to any questions.
Wonderful. The first question for Kate. Again, you can either raise your hand or you can use the Zoom hand feature. Stefan is asking, are you asking what is the process for articling, Stefan?
Yeah, so just what does that entail? Do you have to go, I understand it's a residency or internship, where you learn the new common law or the processes in Canada. Do you have to go and take the equivalent of a bar exam in Canada in that case as well?
Very good question. Yes. So articling is a whole process, and your firm pays for not only the time that you're working here as part of your residency, but then there's a 3-month program called PLTC, which is stands for practical learning training program or something equally mundane. But in any event, that 3-month program, you go into the Law Society every day, you're in a class with other students, and unlike the American bar or any of the American bars where you sit and you take an exam for 2 days and study everything and anything and memorize everything, what they actually have you do is do some practical exams. So for example, you have to learn how to conduct an interview with a client and then actually do that interview with a pretend client, an actor usually, and then they'll grade you on that. And if you do it appropriately, then you'll pass. Writing a letter, any of you have done any summaring positions, then you'll know that a big chunk of what we do on a daily basis is writing letters to the other party and telling them exactly what our position is, or threatening litigation, or whatever it is we want to do or to move the matter forward. Or doing legal research, or doing a moot court exercise. But all of these skills are practical skills that you need to learn as a lawyer. And so in Canada, or at least in BC, they take in the position that these are the skills that you actually need to know and that we're going to test you on. Then at the end of the 3 months, they have you sit down for an open book exam that has some multiple choice and some essays, which is technically our quote unquote bar, but the whole process, that 3-month process is considered our bar exam. So it's a very practical way of testing your ability to be a lawyer. Then once you successfully pass all of that, then you can be called, what we say called to bar, but that is entered into the bar here, and you can practice as a lawyer. But it's a year-long process where you article, do the residency, and then a 3-month program where you learn the skills needed and required to do your job.
That's helpful. Can I just follow up with that? Is that something you'd have to be sponsored by a firm to do that?
Typically, yes. In Canada, it's very difficult to obtain articles. So that's why I welcome any Southwestern students to go ahead and if that's something you're interested in, to apply with me and my firm, or see if there's anybody else that I know that is hiring for articling students. Canada does things a little bit differently. We have fewer law schools, so it's harder to get into law school and even harder to get articles. And that's how they make sure that there's enough lawyers to practice, where the US weeds you out by making you pass a very difficult bar exam. So you've already basically gone through the whole process before you figure out whether or not you actually have the stuff to practice. So just different perspective, but in any event, I think, in my opinion, after going through both processes, I would say that the practical side of passing the actual skills that you need to practice was much more helpful. But yes, a firm does have to sponsor you essentially.
Okay.
Thank you.
Our next question, Patricia, you had asked, where did you do your internship? Are you asking about the one she had during law school?
I mean, I can just answer, but I had 3 internships, I guess. So as I mentioned, Harriet Buhai was one of them. Prototypes was another one, and both Prototypes and Harriet Buhai are very similar. And then the third was a clerkship with the Los Angeles City Attorney.
Great, thanks, Kate. Okay, the next question. It was mentioned that you might discuss what it's like dealing with domestic violence survivors/victims while their abusers are with them. I think this is really kind of speaking to the effects of COVID right now. Can you please elaborate on your experience with these types of domestic violence cases?
Yeah, so domestic violence has taken a turn for the worse during the pandemic because it takes place in the home. So when you're required to be home all the time, you're obviously going to be in contact with your abuser at just more time, because that's the reality. So for example, in May, I had to, it was my first domestic violence application during the pandemic, where I was taking the affidavit of my client, and her abuser was not in the next room, but in the home. And so that was a very difficult experience that, because we had to be careful. I mean, she could at any moment get off. I mean, we were able to put in video conferencing affidavits during this time. I don't know if California has done that as well, but in any event, having to speak with a client who can't leave the house and has no other place to go, and no longer has the excuse of, well, I need to go to the store to pick something up, or I have to go to work, or because all of the excuses they had to get out of the home to be able to speak with someone to get help are now gone. So it was much more difficult to contact clients, to speak with them privately, and to get them out of the home, because a lot of what the court was looking at is, well, okay, so great, we can get her out of the home, but where is she going to go? Before, we had access to emergency shelters. Well, none of those shelters are now accepting anybody. We didn't really know what was going on with COVID at the time. So are we able to can they even go to anybody else's house? So these were all very difficult issues that we're dealing with. And even now, doing a consult today, speaking with a woman who, doesn't know where else she can go with her children, because she doesn't have any family, for example. So everyone is outside of her bubble. And so there's lots of fears and unknowns, and it's changed how we do our job. But yeah, I think the biggest problem is there's just less excuses to get them out. So.
Great. Thank you, Kate. Amir, I think you had your hand up. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes, I did in fact have a question. However, Kate answered that when she was answering Stefan's question. So thank you for coming back to me, though.
Okay, sorry, that's very difficult to hear. So I don't know if if you had a question, I can't hear it. Sorry.
The audio was a little garbled, but
Garbled.
I think he said he had his question answered.
Okay, great.
Okay, so the next question from Yasmin. What was the process of searching for a job while in law school, and when did you transition from fundraising work to legal work? Was it while in law school?
Yes, so I actually was working during law school and fundraising, and then I was actually, because I worked in higher education fundraising, and then I actually did some fundraising for Southwestern for a little while, and then while I was doing that, so I was supporting myself with the fundraising gig, but then on the side, I was doing the clerkships and the internships. So I was always doing both all at the same time. And so it was a slow process. And then because I then had to move and cross the border and come back home, and I didn't have my law degree yet certified in Canada, having that second career really enabled me I went back into fundraising to support myself financially while I was, again, studying to pass the bar and get myself situated to practice law here. So for me, having two careers was very helpful, because I needed to support myself. And fundraising, I didn't need the government to stamp my degree or my resume or credentials to be able to work in Canada.
I guess more specifically, how did you hear about or apply for, what was the process in getting the clerkships?
In Los Angeles?
Yes.
So
through the externship office?
Yeah, it was just through the exchange. I think I came to them and was like, this is what I'm interested in. They're like, this is what's available. And I was like, great, that sounds great. And actually what ended up happening with the externship with the city attorney was I had actually applied to work for a nonprofit legal clinic in Australia, because I was planning to move to Australia for a bit. And then I had a family emergency, and so I couldn't move to Australia. And so, but I needed something lined up to do a legal clinic of some sort. And so it was really late in the day as well. In the externship office, I went to them and I said, what do you have available? I'm interested in, family, so any family firms or anything like that. And they had an opening in the special victims unit, or the equivalent. It may not be called special victims unit, but it was essentially dealing with issues of elder abuse, sexual violence, stalking, that sort of thing. It was very interesting. I highly recommend that office, because you're not dealing with, the district attorney where it's slam dunks. You either prosecute, or, if you have the evidence, or you don't. Everything else, the wobblers, as they called them, went to the city attorney. So there was much more a gray area that you're dealing with to prosecute. It was really interesting. I learned a lot about evidence. But it was also really tough to deal with those sorts of cases, and reading the police reports were very difficult for me personally. And so it was a really good learning experience to learn that that was not my cup of tea. But yeah, Southwestern was great in getting me hooked up with that.
Great. Thanks so much.
So there are two different offices that help with job searches of various natures. So the externship office, which we were just referring to, helps with all forms of externships. And then we separately have a career services office, which helps with the more traditional forms of job searches.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, Javon had a two-part question. How do you remain objective in your cases? And is there a case that has stayed with you?
Oh, I mean, part of our job is to advocate for our clients. So yes, you always need to look at the bigger picture and be objective, but you also need to be a zealous advocate for your client. You know, when I'm looking at evidence and what my client's evidence is, you know, sometimes I can look at them and say, you know, the evidence that you're giving, I believe you that this person has abused you in a variety of ways, but your evidence isn't strong enough to get a protection order. So you need to think about getting these types of orders. Or I'll say, look, because you've gone back and forth and, you know, you've recanted your evidence, for example, or then you have to advise your client about what the likely outcome is when you're going through these cases. With respect to what stuck with me, I think what was the most impactful is I had a gentleman who came in and, you know, 6 foot tall, big guy. And, you know, he told me how his spouse was beating him up. And that was very difficult because of the optics. His ex-spouse she was teeny tiny, 5'2". And so the optics, like purely just walking into the court, that was going to go against me. So I had to do a lot of work to get this gentleman a protection order and to make the court believe that this little teeny tiny person could actually beat up this big man. And that was difficult because I had to do so much work. So it was also twice as expensive for this gentleman because I didn't have to just do one affidavit of his affidavit evidence. I had to get his friends to explain to the court what, you know, that they had seen him with a black eye. I had to get text messages downloaded, you know, showing her verbal abuse over the ages. I had to go above and beyond, and we did get the protection order for him, but it was fighting against optics, and that has really stuck with me. I think the other part of it too was that, you know, for women, there's a lot of different resources out there for women, support groups and shelters and things like that, and that just doesn't exist for men. And you know, for some of my male friends who have talked to me about the, you know, problems in their relationships, there's just so much more stigma out there. And it's unfortunate that a lot of the services for men who are victims of domestic violence are just not out there. And so that has stuck with me.
Thank you, Kate. You mentioned taking the one specific tax law course. Were there any other courses you recommend taking in law school that you feel are vital to family law practice?
Not really. Like I said before, family law kind of touches on the big issues. So for example, you know, property is always a big issue that I have to deal with. Contract law, you know, especially if there was a prenuptial agreement. What else? Tort. Sometimes we have to deal with the issue of tort. If, for example, you know, the spouse was involved in an accident and got some sort of award from, we call them ICBC, but that's the only insurance company in town. So, you know, how is that going to be divided, if it is going to be divided? But I have to say, I didn't take tax. It hasn't been fatal to my practice, but I think it would have also given me a leg up as well, just having a bigger and better understanding of tax law. But, you know, if I was in your position right now and someone was telling me to take a tax class, I don't know if I would take a tax class. So there you go.
Okay, so Amir did have a different question now. He said, as someone who is interested in night school, can you briefly speak about your experience working 40 hours a week and going to school at night? I know time management is key, but what other piece of advice would you give someone who's thinking of going down that path? Would you also say that you were at a disadvantage compared to days time students when it came to take the bar?
So hindsight being 2020, during my time of working 40 plus hours a week and then going to law school at night, it was very difficult. And I'm not sure, it was good in the sense that it really prepared me for my articles, where I was doing exactly that. And I had the work ethic and the ability to work as much and as hard as I did when I was working full time and then going to school at night. And in fact, that during my articles, I was able to survive articles where many people before me had quit because they couldn't handle the amount of work and the number of hours it takes to get the job done and to do it properly. At the same time, yeah, I do think my grades suffered. I don't think I did as well as I could have because I just didn't have the time to be in the library from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. studying. I was in my office from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. doing my job. So that's just the reality. Something has to give. And in my case, I preferred to sleep the extra few hours so that I could maintain my sanity instead of getting better grades. But that was my choice. At the end of the day, it's interesting because the woman I articled for, who is known throughout Vancouver as being exceptionally difficult to work for, commented that she's hired lots of people who had straight A's and they were completely worthless when it came to doing the practical work, of which is putting in the hard work to get the job done. And I did not have straight A's. I will be the first one to say that. That doesn't mean that if you have straight A's, that doesn't mean that you don't work hard. I went to, the night students that I went to school with were some of the hardest working people that I know. Some of them had full-time jobs plus kids at home and were going to school at night. And I literally don't know how that's possible, like without having two of you. I just don't know how it's possible, but kudos to them. So in the long run, coming out of it on the other end, now I think I'm set up. I have the work ethic in place where I can do the work and have the mental stamina to get it done. And I'm not sure that my peers in the day program were given that opportunity to practice that for their 3 or 4 years while they were there. That being said, lots of wonderful students in the day program. This is not a dissing fest. There's different skills that you're going to acquire if you have to manage your time so strictly and stay with it for so long. So.
Right. Okay, so let me see. We've got a little less than 10 minutes, a few other questions here. Are there any notable differences in the application of the law and procedures in Canada versus the US? Also, how are US trained lawyers generally received in other countries?
Interesting. Okay, so a couple of fun ones. The application of the law, obviously the rule of law applies. It doesn't matter. We look at precedent, so common law prevails, except in Quebec, but Quebec, they do their own thing, so I'm not going to talk about that. But in any event, so for example, we are required to robe up when we go into trial. I don't have to wear a wig, but I do have very formal robes that would look very identical to the robes that you would see judges wearing. We also say we have 2 levels. We have masters and we have judges. The only jurisdictional difference is really that judges tend to make final orders and masters make interim orders. But judges we address as my lord or my lady, or her ladyship or his lordship. I don't know how they're going to deal with the non-binary issue when it gets to that level, but for now we're my lord, my lady. We also bow whenever a master or a judge enters the room. However, now that we're all on the phone, I have not been doing a lot of bowing lately, but it is the custom to bow. And what other fun things do we do?
Are there any of those things that
that's
you just completely want to balk at, or you just accept it as, this is what we do here? Like the first time you had to call somebody my lord, was it strange to you, or were you prepared for that because of doing the articles and just knowing what the process would be? You just kind of took it with a grain of salt?
I mean, my lord or my lady does not, it's not like they're better than you. That's not what the lord or lady title says. It is a sign of respect to the court and to the rule of law. And so when you say my lord or my lady, it is, you're respecting the court. Just the same as and with a master, I say, your honor, which is no different from what the terminology that you would use in California courts. The only one that was really weird for me to wrap my head around was your worship, which is for, I want to say a registrar. Anyway, it's another judge or administrative judge. I'm not quite sure, but I had to use it once, and your worship was a little bit for me to swallow. But again, using my lord or my lady and bowing is, again, it's a sign of respect to the court and to the position that they hold, and it's not necessarily to subjugate yourself to that person. And I had known about that prior to my article, just because when I was in Australia doing a study abroad there, that was you bow upon when Parliament opens, and also I'd seen some court there, and so that was familiar to me as well. But yeah, did I answer? There was a second part to that question. Did I answer?
The second part, yes. How are U.S. trained lawyers generally received in other countries?
So I have a couple of friends in law that were trained in the States, and I find that American trained lawyers, especially when it comes to, for example, passing exams, use the IRAC system really well. So in my experience, my American trained friends they tend to pass them pretty easily. We also only need to take 4 or 5. It was 4 when I first started this. It might be 5 now, exams. But my friends who come from Australia and Britain, just because they do it a little bit differently, they've had to take between 6 and 8 exams. So I think it speaks to our training in the States and to a lot of the similarities between how we practice in Canada and the US that allows us to transition a little bit more easily than some of my friends in other Commonwealth countries. On another note, we also, when referring to opposing counsel in court, we say my friend. And if we want to be a little bit snobby, then we say my learned friend. I have yet to say my learned friend, but yes, we call opposing counsel my friend.
That's because you're a nice person.
No, that's required.
No, I mean, you haven't referred to them as your learned friend.
Oh, well, no, not yet. I haven't gotten that. I haven't been that snobby yet, but yes.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. I have some, of course, but if there's any other guests here that have a student for Kate, we can take yours instead of one of mine. Anybody else? I know there's a few people who haven't had a chance to ask anything. No? Okay. So let's see. Is there another area of law that you can see yourself wanting to move towards? And if so, about how far off in your career are you envisioning that? Are you seeing sort of the next step yet, or do you still feel like there's so much more work for you to be doing in family law?
Oh, that's a good question. I think if anything, I'd be interested in doing property litigation. It's not really that far off from what I do now, since I tend to be fighting about property in any event. But I find that the issues of property are they're very old school, dealing with some of the, appeasements and, sorry, not appeasements, easements and covenants and those types of issues, looking at titles, the values of property I find really interesting. So I might go in the direction of property litigation or strata litigation. And strata here is just a fancy way of saying homeowners association. So condo owners fighting between each other or with their strata council, which in the States is called homeowners association. So that I can see really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Great. Any last remarks, Kate, on your behalf that you want to share with the group? Anything we didn't cover, or anything that you just want to make sure they know about? Anything that maybe you wished someone had told you starting law school?
Oh,
I know that's probably a long list.
But yeah, it is a long list. All I would say is, work as hard as you can, but give yourself a break. Like at the end of the day, yeah, I guess a lot of places look at your grades and that's important to some extent, but it's the people that you meet, and, develop a passion for an area of law. Because if you're just doing this for the paycheck at the end of the day, that will make you miserable. So find an area of law that you're really and truly interested in. And if it is tax, great. I don't understand it, but great. Or litigation, or being a solicitor, what do you call a solicitor? Just a regular like transactions lawyer. But just make sure that when you practice law, like you really find it interesting, because it can be very difficult. What we do is difficult. It keeps you up at night, and you need to care about what you're doing at the end of the day. So
that's great. Well, we are on the dot on time.
Great.
So, thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, Kate, so much for spending. I know you were saying this is going to be an incredibly busy week for you. So thank you so much for this time.
Happy to help.
Students.
Yeah, happy to. And like I said, if anyone is interested in coming north of the 49th, give me a shout. Happy to give you a few pointers. And of course, if we have a position open, either for summering or whatever else, I'd be happy to have you on our team, because we have tons of work here in family law. So.
That's great. That's great. And thank you for extending that offer. If anybody would like to get into contact with Kate, you are welcome to reach out to me, and I will pass along your information to her. So you can reach me at the email address I'm going to drop right here, or of course at the admissions office general email. So thank you everyone for participating. Look out for our future events. We've got a whole roster coming up. So thank you everyone, and have a good night.